Hi, welcome to Beyond the Filter. I'm here with Isaac Schankler, who is a composer for games. We actually did a panel at the event Different Games in New York a year and a half ago, and professor of new music at Cal Poly Pomona. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Uh,
that works.
okay. And you also run a concert series, which you said we'll talk about later.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
Um, So the reason why I'm having you on is, as we talked about before, is I wanted some kind of your thoughts on your experience with the whole sphere of new music, like more academic sphere of music, because I'm a composer and everything, and I've had some not so positive experiences with it. I'm not really part of that world, but so I'm kind of curious to get your perspective. I guess first of all, the question that I'd ask is like, what distinguishes new music, or what distinguishes it from something else, and where did that whole thing sort of come from?
Right. So that's a really good question. It's a really big question. I wonder if I can I wonder if there's a way to break it down. So when people talk about quote unquote new music as like a musical category, um, there's been a whole bunch of other, I guess, terms for it, contemporary classical music or modern music even. Um, you can kind of break it down as this sort of outgrowth or continuation of kind of like Western classical music going like into the 20th century and 21st century. Though as you get closer and closer to the 21st century, um, it starts to get a little fuzzier because what happens is, what happens naturally with music and other art forms is that a lot of sort of cross-pollination starts to happen. People wanting it to be less insular, so it starts absorbing influences from pop music, influences from jazz, influences from other cultures. So that starts to get a little nebulous and hard to define. And so it's a kind of this kind of broad kind of ecosystem now where, some things that might be considered new music might almost sound like pop music. Um, they might be very tonal, they might be very pretty. Um, and then you might have something that's kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum that's very avant-garde, very something that's more focused on uh, something that might be more focused on timbre or conceptual things as opposed to pitch and melody and harmony. So this is getting to be pretty long-winded, but
That's
that's
fine.
kind of my general uh, end points, and then you can imagine everything that's in the middle of that.
Yeah, I'm interested in that because it does seem kind of like very amorphous. I mean, there's
Hmm.
the tropes that I perceive are more of this sort of atonal conceptual stuff. At least when I went to school at Oberlin College,
Right.
not the conservative, but there's a conservatory there that is pretty well regarded. Uh, and I went to a lot of the concerts there because a lot of my friends were in those programs, and a lot of the stuff there was very conceptual, and it was very stigmatized, at least within the composition department, to write any sort of tonal music.
Right. Yeah, and I know that Oberlin specifically is like that, as well as to an extent Mills, where you said you also had heard some stuff.
Yeah, Mills College in Oakland has a graduate program. Oh, it has an undergraduate too, but like it has a graduate music program that's well regarded. My friend Tammy went there, and so I went to a lot of concerts and stuff there. And but by the way, when I say tonal, it's like what we think of as traditional scales and forms of music, like pop music. Almost all pop music is, tonal, whereas, something like uh, atonal is like without sort of a center or whatever. It's more, I don't know how to exactly summarize those distinctions really quickly,
Yeah,
but
it's hard to succinctly say what that is and or isn't. Yeah,
basically like most pop music and music you listen to is tonal.
right. Yeah, that's fair to say. Um, yeah, I would say it's interesting to me because it's almost like there are these little kind of pockets that are often based around like academic departments or academic centers and sort of like where so like it's this weird thing like your encounter with new music and how you end up feeling about it or thinking about it um, might have a lot to do with like where you are geographically and and what academic music you've encountered because there's new music and things that are kind of like I said, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum from what might be happening at Oberlin and Mills. Even though I like that stuff like quite a bit, and there's a lot of that happening where I live too in Los Angeles. But it ends up being a lot more broad than that. But then there's also this kind of so to kind of like jump back a little bit in history. Um, so kind of throughout the 20th century, there's this general trend of music getting more and more atonal or quote unquote difficult or dissonant, whatever you might want to call it. And then that's sort of like culminated in the 60s and 70s. And then around that time, there was like a really strong resistance to that. And that's where you get stuff like minimalism and composers like, Philip Glass and Steve Reich, who, and Lamont Young too, though he's a little different. You get composers who are kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. And so there's this kind of like schism. There's this kind of like, I almost want to call it like a trauma that happens. And so like, I think we're now still kind of like in the wake of that schism or that trauma, so that people now, at least people of like my generation, don't see these things necessarily as opposed. You can make avant-garde music, you can make music that's conceptual or that's more based on sound or timbre, or you can make pretty tonal music, and that's okay. Both things are new music. But I will say that there's still kind of like this like residual debris or something from that time period when these things were like totally opposed to one another. Where a lot of that shows up is in these sort of like academic departments where there's kind of almost this like house style. Like if you go to Oberlin, though I think Oberlin is changing right now.
Yeah,
but if you went
it
to
might be different now because this was like 10 years ago.
yeah.
Maybe a little less than 5 to 10 years ago.
But yeah, if you go to one department, there might be one house style, and then another department, somewhere else, there's like a totally different house style that might, sound completely different. And though that's not true everywhere, it just sort of like, it's almost like there was this like, explosion, and then you have these like little pockets of debris here and there that that are kind of remnants of that explosion. To make a weird analogy weirder.
Yeah, I mean it like from all I know about music history, and by music quote unquote music history as in European music history, there is that kind of like everything that happens after is always a reaction to the previous thing.
Right. You can't help it. It's just, yeah.
Like the religious music becomes more secular, which and but then there are very particular rules which then start to change, and like it like dynamics and that kind of stuff come into play. And then like with like romantic music, it's like people trying to expand those forms into a way that's more personally expressive, and then like people are just trying to break with those forms entirely, and then people are trying to break with the idea that you even have to have an orchestra or anything to play anything. And then and then you have people reacting against how too conceptual and you know, right-brained everything is, or left-brained. I forget which.
Right.
Uh, uh, I always get those two mixed up. Left-brained. Everything
Right, right,
is.
right, right. Yeah, it doesn't have to be as analytical. Well, yeah, and this is something I think I think about from time to time because I feel like I don't know if this is true of other people who make stuff, but it's definitely true of like composers of new music, is that I feel like it's almost necessary for for composers to feel like that they're reacting against something or that they're resisting something, that they're, you know, to feel like that they're doing something that's against the status quo. But the thing is that it's so hard to even say like what is the status quo, um, and it becomes hard to say like what, you know, what what then do you have to offer if there's no one status quo? What are you trying to accomplish? And so I think in the face of that, some composers feel like they have to be they imagine a status quo that doesn't exist. So
Yeah.
the composers who are writing really tonal music imagine themselves in resistance to this, you know, this experimentalism that's, you know, ruining everything. And then people who are writing really conceptual stuff are imagining them, you know, you know, maybe in resistance to this idea of, you know, music as this commercial commodity or something like that. There's always this kind of language of resistance that seems to hover around it.
Yeah, although maybe that's one thing that has changed a bit, because I feel like more and more people who are getting into that stuff, they're hearing everything at once. Like they're not necessarily getting it through the same lines of tradition. They're getting it through like there you can consume, you can listen to, you know, like Bach at the same time that you listen to like, you know, Edgar Varese or somebody, or like
Right.
you know, pop music with like hyper conceptual stuff, and that's something that like is all accessible. And you know, obviously like the way that things are, um listening to classical music that's highly compressed or whatever it's not as enjoyable of an experience as listening to pop music when it's highly compressed.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but everyone is kind of getting it through, just it's all there at once, and maybe there isn't as much of a sense of opposition, because now it's more like you can sort of pick and choose where you want to focus your efforts on, or at least that's like maybe my more optimistic view of it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things to me is that like, you know, if you're just a listener having an encounter with this music, you know, that sort of dialogue is totally absent. So I don't know. I was kind of curious because you were kind of talking about the um, experience of encountering this music as, you know, feeling like an outsider to this kind of world. Um, so I was curious yeah, what is your reaction or your experience when you come into contact with that kind of music that's more maybe more conceptual or or more experimental?
Well, so I will say my first experience at Oberlin, I didn't know anything about that sort of tradition. I knew some about classical music. I mean, like I was in orchestra and I played cello. I
Right.
never considered myself like really good at it, and I didn't really want to pursue that. Um, but I had considered, you know, majoring in music in school, and I like was considering trying to get into like the music and technology program at Oberlin. which didn't end up happening, and I actually had the person in charge of the program told me I had an attitude problem, um,
God.
which I've told this story before, but basically because I didn't go through proper channels. I was making music that was influenced by video game music, and I didn't really have any
Right.
adults to show it to, and this was the closest thing to somebody, um, who could be a mentor or whatever. And the guy was probably like, well, who's this person just coming in? Like, you have to do the proper, and I just like I didn't have any
Right.
context for any of that, so
Right.
I immediately it rubbed me the wrong way. I was like, this is weird, and I guess like I experienced the thing where if you didn't go through the bureaucracy in the correct way, then you didn't get in, and that's what happened. And I'm happy that I didn't go into that like program and ended up doing something else. Like I ended up being a film
Right.
major because I don't know like that it I don't know. But so my view at the time, I was in college. I was very I didn't get like the conceptual stuff really at all. And I was interested in classical music and I was interested in being a part of that, but like I don't really think I understood the purpose of the stuff that was more conceptual, and I don't know, it felt very like strange and elitist to me coming from a place like where in the middle of Ohio where a lot of people just don't even appreciate art or or care about it. Like that is like it seemed to me like it was all in dialogue with stuff that like I had no context to understand, and
Right.
no one was offering the context to me. And if you wanted to understand it, you had to say and do the right things. And oftentimes saying and doing the right things meant that you either grew up in it or you grew up in a place
Right.
with like, privilege and access to that. And, that was my whole feeling about Oberlin in general, was that like, wow, I didn't go to a private school in New York, so I guess I am, because there were a lot of kids who were coming from that context. So and I mean the conservatory was a little bit different, but it still had that
Right.
kind of especially the electronic music program had the more quote unquote hipster
Yeah. Yeah.
reputation. But anyways, so since then, like I think I understand. Like I got more interested in conceptual stuff. I got involved in like experimental game stuff, and I started to see the intersection with audio stuff there. And I'm more like I have a more benign view of that stuff now, but I do think that a lot of it is just I think I see I feel like I see through a lot of it now. Like I see a lot of tropes and forms like keep coming up.
Mm.
Like in going to Mills, I saw um this one thing that I feel like I've seen at least 5 or 6 times now. More than that, like which is basically someone noodling on an instrument into a patch in Max MSP, and it
Yeah.
spitting out like a bunch of weird sounds.
Right.
And the patch probably has some convoluted theoretical thing behind it that you cannot hear at all because it just sounds like noises coming out of the speaker.
Yeah. That's a genre. Yeah.
um, and so there's some of that stuff which I'm just like, this is boring. But then I saw a lot of other stuff and there's also what my friend Tammy calls whooshy music, which is basically like, Edgar
But
Varese-ish, or Stockhausen, ish. Those are mid 20th century experimental electronic composers that are like musique concrète kind of, lots of different sounds, not really a particular form. And that's the stuff that I actually was pretty interested in when I was younger.
uh-huh.
I think that's like, if I ended up getting into that stuff, that's probably the stuff that I would have gotten into, because I did listen to I mean I listened to like, pop and rock music, but I listened to stuff like the Olivia Tremor Control, which is
Yeah. Yeah.
like a 60s aping band that has like a lot of like musique concrète stuff in it. Um
Right. Right.
So I think that's the side that I was like more interested in. But I don't know. I feel like there is a part of me that feels like that stuff is really stodgy, and I could never like, and I mean like, especially after graduating from college and being in debt, I realized like this is not affordable to most people. A lot of these schools are expensive, and
Right.
a lot of people who are in that world stay in that world because it almost seems like they're afraid, or like they're afraid that there's no application of it outside of academia, so you keep feeding into like academia over and over and over again. You go to you go and undergraduate, and then you go masters, and you go and get your PhD or whatever, and then you become a teacher, and then you
Like
teach
me.
students to do that. And I mean,
Yeah.
it is what it is, but like it feels like it's just feeding into a system that I don't know that I want to
Yeah.
support.
No, and I completely agree with you actually, in kind of what you're saying. And I think back to that kind of like initial interaction that you had with the department at Oberlin, and I think it's so, I don't know, it's so unfortunate that you had that interaction and so like easily avoidable. Because I mean, on the one hand, like, yeah, that department at Oberlin was probably not the best equipped to like, help you with the craft of your video game influenced music, right? Because that was just not something that they were,
They didn't
uh,
have any understanding of that.
yeah, or interested in or involvement of that. And but that is such like, an easy thing to say, right? Like maybe we're not the best people to help you with this, which would have been such a better way to put it than the interaction that you had, right?
Yeah.
Um, because not every person is going to be able to help you with that. That's like the thing about music, is that it's so open like that. But
Well, the thing is, like a lot of private universities, especially, they're all about marketing, and they want to market themselves as being as open and diverse on
that's true.
about
Yeah.
with different styles. And I've seen that a lot where people are like, "Oh, we're yeah, we have a variety. We try to get a variety of different people there." And then,
Right.
what ends up happening is even if you do get a variety of different, like there was somebody who got into that program who made video game influenced music, but in the end, like you're all encouraged to make one kind of music.
Right. Yeah, and I think like from the other side, what, kind of like, as someone who kind of like walks back and forth across this line from time to time, um, the feeling that I get and that I'm somewhat sympathetic to is that, um, I mean, I think you're right that they're afraid. Um, and I think they actually have, some of them at least, for some reasons, have good reason to be afraid, because because yeah, there's some inkling of this idea that this music wouldn't exist outside of this environment.
Mm.
It's almost like this hermetically sealed environment, um, which which can be like really alienating to outsiders. But I think maybe from that perspective, from the other perspective, it's, um, we need, it's that underdog syndrome again. It's like that idea of resistance. We have to protect this thing, uh, so that it continues to exist. And it feels like, I think for some people it feels like a fight for literal survival, which is funny because then it makes them sort of like a little bit blind to the privileges and advantages that they might be receiving. And it also weirdly makes them blind to like, okay, you've protected your music, but what about like all the other potential music that isn't afforded these protections? What about that?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
but there's also the thing of like, if you are if you were going to so much effort to defend and isolate and insulate off this particular thing because you're afraid it's going to die, aren't you
Yeah.
just cutting it off of oxygen? Like, aren't you putting it in a place where you're ensuring that people who are coming from the outside can't come in and see like, oh, okay, I get why this stuff is valuable, and use it for their own like thing that might not be related to it. Like, it feels like it's isolating itself off from people who could be coming in, who could be like continuing some of the better parts of that into something else, like and by trying to preserve this by trying to preserve so intensely this form and this tradition.
Right. Yeah, and I think you're right, and I think a lot of people, some people are coming around to that point of view, um, and saying, like this doesn't this doesn't destroy this thing to admit that there are other things that exist. Um, to, I mean, that's a completely like, that's probably a straw man way of putting it. I'm probably not being entirely fair by putting it that way, but but yeah, I think people are coming around, and I think people are coming around for different reasons too, because obviously one of the um, kind of like byproducts of this insularity is that new music continues to be, largely like, the province of like white, cis, male, European descended, people.
Yeah, there's definitely a strong element of preserving tradition. Is There's a strong element of preserving it against uh more like basically all music that's descended from like black music, like like rock and roll music going down to blues music, or like hip hop, or like uh house and techno. Those are all like non-establishment forms when they started.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, and it's not like, it's this funny thing because, by and large politically, like it's super duper liberal. Um, so I don't think there's any, there's certainly no bigoted intent, but there's this kind of like blinkered kind of view that I think is changing. I'm actually kind of optimistic about it. I've seen kind of like signs of things changing, potentially pretty rapidly for this. There's this festival called Darmstadt, which is like a big new music festival in Germany,
Mm.
it goes back at least, I think at least to the mid 20th century, which is where uh, some of those mid-century modernist composers like Stockhausen, who I think you mentioned, and Boulez kind of converged there.
Hmm.
So it's kind of um, so in some ways it's kind of the upholding this modernist tradition. And I've actually never been because I'm like that's so like not my world. Like I but I know a lot of people who go or who have gone, and this year for the first time they had like a panel on like gender, like which seems like a like such a small basic thing, but is actually like a pretty huge thing in that world for that to actually happen and to be acknowledged. And it was at least within my sort of like friend circle, it was like probably the most talked about thing that happened there. So I think, people are realizing or starting to realize that like, um, something needs to be done. Um, people have talked a long time about trying to make this music more quote unquote accessible, but then they don't realize, but they think about doing it through the music itself, right? Let's make the music itself more accessible somehow, and lots of arguments about what that actually means. Um, but kind of going back to what you were saying about, you know, not being able to do this unless you're already kind of well versed in it, or I forget exactly what you said, but like you mentioned something about economics or finances. I forget exactly what you said.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so many people just can't afford to go into these programs and
Right,
continue to go to school, like, to get to the point where they can become a teacher or become, an established part of that world.
right. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about and what other people are thinking about now is okay, like forget about making it musically accessible. Like that's maybe a red herring. Let's think about making it like economically accessible. Let's thinking about making it accessible to different types of people, and not just, to listeners, but to people who might, want to make this kind of music. And that's, um, maybe a harder question to answer, but I think it's much closer to like the real question that needs to be answered.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Well, when I went to Mills, they have a concert series every year called Signal Flow. Um, so I went this past year, and there was some stuff I didn't like, but there were quite a few things where people were doing things. They weren't only just doing audio, but they were doing things with video. They were doing things with performance, like performance art, like acting kind of stuff. And like staging. They were doing
Hmm.
things with like software games/games kind of design. Like that's what Tammy's stuff is. She does like Game Boy uh, instruments, and there was like one or two other things that also were kind of on the software end. And I thought that that was really interesting, the variety of like influences, and I think that that's great. Like, I mean, I'm all about being omnivorous, or not omnivorous, but like like doing trying to experiment with as many forms as possible, because I think
Yeah.
there's it's getting easier and easier to do that, and um, they're so connected in so many ways, and I think it strengthens a piece to have like multiple dimensions like that. So at least for me, so I really like that, and I hope that continues, and I think that that's one way in which more people can sort of see that there's something here and it's interesting, and it's not pop music, or whatever. It's not like
Right.
it's not like trying to be something like pop music, because it's never going to be that. And like the thing is, like, I mean, I love a lot of things about pop music, but there's a lot of limitations to it. Like, like
Right.
I have a lot of problems with it, and like, you know, it's true with so many different things, like pop, hip hop, electronic music, all that stuff. There are forms, and they become commercially viable, and they become the hip and cool thing, but then they grow stale like really quickly. And so like I don't I think that it's good that there's like a space for experimentation and something more challenging, and I
Right.
I always
Yeah.
like want to support that. And you can say that that's inaccessible. I know a lot of people on the internet who would say that any experimental art is inaccessible, and that's just
Right.
like, that's just like we need to define inaccessible. Like, we need to is it like you don't want to put the effort into it because it makes
Right.
you feel uncomfortable, or you can't afford to put the effort into it, or that it's excluding you because of who you are? And those are like two
Right.
things that are important to separate out. Like, the latter is a huge problem, but the former, like, it would be great, like, if people could listen to if, like, I miss that I can't sit down and listen to Bach or something like that, and like, with somebody else, and like um we can appreciate that and talk about, like, I like doing that, like. And maybe I don't want to make music exactly like that, but it strengthens, like, me as a human being and as an artist or whatever, to have something like that, that more like deep listening experience. And there's totally use for this stuff, and it doesn't have to like, change outside of the territory of being more experimental or artistic or conceptual. It just needs to find ways to become more like economically accessible and more accessible to a more diverse group of people, both in the West and elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really well put. I sort of wanted to ask, this is backtracking a tiny bit, but um, I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned going to this concert, um, I wanted to ask if you've had any particularly positive interactions with new music, if there was any particular piece or something that engaged you, um, and if so, what was it? What was it about that thing? And what made it engaging to you that sort of overrode this maybe uh, elitist feeling that you sometimes get from the music?
So there were a few things. I mean, I'm biased, but Tammy's Game Boy performance was interesting because it was like a piece of art that was projected on the screen, but it was being performed, and it wasn't just being performed as in they were drawing it, but it was also being performed musically.
Right.
Um, and so you see this like I think it was like a tree or something. I don't remember exactly. Be constructed, and it's made of what people are doing, playing this Game Boy, and I don't know. It felt more connected with some kind of like it's like more naturalistic or something. It's like
Huh.
more kind of connected with painting a picture than it is with a particular form or something that I don't really have a familiarity with. Which a lot of things do. They're referencing other things or forms that I don't have the context for. Um,
So having this kind of like visual analog uh, helped you kind of relate to it or something?
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and there was another piece that was, I mean, it was within the realm of quote unquote whooshy pieces, as in it was just like an audio piece, but it was a narrative about this guy stopping at like a fast food restaurant in the middle of like in between in that sort of desert in between L.A. and the Bay Area, and some guy came up to him and gave him a slingshot, and said that he was going to need this, and then like several months later he was like diagnosed with cancer. Like in real life this happened, and I mean I knew that I think it wasn't talked about in the actual thing, but
Uh-huh.
like it was like a narrative, and it was like he was telling the narrative on the audio piece, and it was like pretty well told, and it was a piece of music as well, so I liked that.
So it was like a spoken narrative,
Yeah,
verbal?
it was a
Yeah.
spoken narrative with obviously a lot of other musical stuff happening in it, but and let's see, there was another like kind of weird, I don't know how to describe it. It was like some kind of stage performance thing. Gosh, I'm trying to think of a way to describe it. But like it was very like weird and disturbing, and it was kind of this like abstract narrative performance that this guy was doing, and there were like lighting cues on stage and stuff, and it was also kind of a narrative, but there was like different, something was projected on the screen. It was there was like a staging, a performance to it, and then there was also music playing, and it was kind of more of a multimedia experience than something that is just straight audio.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think like I like things that mesh different kinds of forms together, and people who are more about the tradition want to preserve like just like we just want the story to be told through this music and the way that it's sequenced and all that kind of stuff, and like
Right.
I don't really. I don't really understand. I increasingly understand that whole separation between forms less and less. Like I just don't necessarily think it's necessary.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I've known some people. I know one composer in particular who was really resistant to, well, he was not resistant to the idea of uh his music being his music accompanying visuals, like accompanying a film or something like that. He wasn't resistant to the idea, but he was resistant to like almost any actual um actual execution of that. Um because his feeling was that it sort of like it anchored it too much or something. Because once you bind it to like this narrative, then it's sort of like permanently stuck to that narrative, right? And it's hard for it to be anything else. Like even in your mind, which can be like a really powerful thing. Like if you think back to like even like music, from childhood, like that's in a sense like narrative music for us because it's part of like the narrative of your life.
hmm
Um, and so, but it's so permanently stuck to that, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I don't know how much you'd agree with that because I know you've composed for games.
right. I mean, I'll say I'm sympathetic to that, even though I am much more maybe permissive about that. Um, I sort of figure I sort of figure that music kind of like accumulates associations anyway. It's sort of what it does. It's like a sort of like a katamari of like emotions, or something.
hmm
Um, so like that process is going to happen anyway, and I can't really control that process when it gets out of my hands anyway. So to me, even the thought of trying is just like this almost completely futile endeavor. But like I can kind of understand kind of like at least out of the gate just saying like, okay, this is like a musical artifact and um, I want people to have their own personal association with it and I don't want to tell you what that is and I don't want anyone else to tell you what that is.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really nice about that. I think there's something really powerful about that. Um, and it's something I think about when I contrast the like the like the rock show experience and the concert hall experience. Um, where the rock show experience is like this communal thing. Like everyone, you can sort of see how people are engaging with the music, whether they're dancing or taking pictures or even if they're disengaged with the music, if they're talking or on their phones or whatever. Um, but like there's something like public and communal about that. And then the concert hall thing is almost like this weird paradoxical thing where it is this public event, but then like everyone is kind of like sitting in their own kind of almost like little bubble. And there's no way to know. I mean, you can kind of maybe read body language sometimes, but there's no way to really know like what they're thinking or feeling about this piece. It's this sort of weird public-private thing, and everyone is allowed to have that space to have their own kind of like individual experience and individual associations with the piece. And I think there's something really beautiful about that to me. Um, and
Some
it's funny.
sometimes that stuff kills me because like I really don't like something or I like there's something that is like particularly affects me and
Yeah.
everyone's kind of straight faced and like I must take this seriously.
Yeah, I think it can often come off that way. And which is why I think, one of the kind of current, veins in new music is like how do we bust this music outside of the concert hall? And and so like sometimes it's really effective, but then like sometimes I find it's sort of like really not exactly lazy, but like they just sort of like didn't think through the consequences of the idea of like taking this music outside of the concert hall
Hmm.
and just like sticking it in a bar or something. Because like a lot of that music, at least I feel like it just doesn't work in a bar unless you
No.
do something else to it, you know? Like um so I think a lot of people are thinking about putting it in a more theatrical setting, and actually thinking about, you know, the staging of it and just the idea of like, okay, this is a thing that happens in an actual place. It's not like music you're playing back on your computer. Like it's important that it's happening in a space, so we want to like highlight the fact that this is actually happening here, you know?
Hmm.
Um, and
And
kind of like what you're
that
describing
goes,
in those
yeah.
concepts.
Yeah, exactly. That goes back to the staging and the having video and other things.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the new music pieces I've seen recently that I've been really interested in have this kind of uh, theatrical or staged element that really you can't capture through just the audio. You have to at least see, you know, and sometimes you can kind of capture it on video, um, or just pieces that are more fun to see live. A lot of pieces I've seen, there's this composer named Michelle Liu, and a lot of her pieces incorporate like lots of weird kind of percussion instruments, like kind of like not traditional percussion instruments, but like kind of like homemade objects being used as percussion. Like little tape players being used in the context of performance, so that like you see someone recording something and then playing it back later. Things like that that make it feel like a more kind of special experience for the person who actually, you know, left their house to come to this thing. Um, which, you know, uh, which I think is really important.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Um, I guess I wanted to go back to a second for you were talking about your friend who is uncomfortable with the idea of his their work being associated with a particular thing, like being soundtracked or something.
Right.
I can understand that too, in that like some music or sound, especially sound effects, like but like it did, you know, music for Dysphoria, which got pretty popular, the game,
Mm,
and almost no one ever commented on the music in that game. Like, I mean, some people I know did, but like, you know, if I'm just like looking at comments from people or whatever, you know, like, and part of that is like the game's audience or whatever, but people just perceive it so much as part of the experience for better or for worse. And that's
right.
frustrating to me because I don't feel like my efforts are recognized at all.
Right.
And like people don't even perceive that. So it feels like being erased. And I don't like that. On the other hand, it is stronger by being associated with something else. Like it becomes more of a thing, and it's easier to let go of it and be like, okay, that was that. Because like there is an element of like, I guess there's the whole branding thing, and like it's a survival mechanism for yourself, like where you have your own kind of music and you want to preserve that within itself, and you don't want that to be subjected to other people's whims or whatever, and in order to preserve that you don't want to associate it with other things like too intensely. And I've definitely like I you know, even artists who are considered on the more like left field, or like the more progressive experimental end of like, you know, popular electronic music, so like Holly Herndon or like
Oh yeah.
Arca or One O Tricks Point Never or something. I read an article on a music website categorizing that stuff as neo-futurism. It's like the
Neo.
term
Okay.
that was invented. So like, and you know, in and those things which seem so formless now, like all of those musicians, like we're gonna go back 10 years from now. We're gonna look back and be like, okay, that was like 2010s electronic music, and And I mean, I see that too with like the like, you know, people's like pop stars, like highly conceptual out, like the Life of Pablo, the Kanye West thing, and like Lemonade, Beyonce,
Yeah,
and like
yeah.
Frank Ocean's thing, where people are gonna be like, okay, that was very 2016, you know.
Right, right. Yeah.
Um, and like it seems like this great new thing, but you know, so did everything else at the time that it was made. Well, not everything, but you know, a lot of things like that. So I don't know. I mean, I've definitely gone through it as far as I want to be an artist who is seen for like my music and like that music being something that extends from me and like my internal thoughts or feelings or my universe, and I want to be
Right, right.
recognized for those efforts and not just be viewed as somebody who's, you know, being supporting something else, you know.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Do
but
you feel like
also I do feel like stuff that I've made maybe is stronger in a weird way for sometimes for being associated with other things. So
do you think the music itself is stronger? Um, or do you just feel like it benefits from being part of this thing?
um, I think it benefits the entirety of the thing to have like um,
It's
like
more than the sum of its parts.
yeah to so yeah, exactly. And like the music itself, I mean, I know a lot. I know I've met several people who are don't really do soundtracks for things, who are, you know, artists and say like I want to do game soundtracks or I want to do something like that, because I think there is that element of like I want this universe to be taken further, um,
Yeah.
and I know that there's a limitation from just doing that in audio. So there's both sides of it, and I've definitely seen both sides of it. I think oftentimes people don't understand or respect audio in terms of like both in film and in video game stuff. So that's always the difficulty with trying to compose for those things, unless you are working with somebody who
Right.
has a respect for it.
Well, yeah, especially in films, it's sort of like the hallmark of good audio is that like is often that you don't notice it, right?
Yeah.
So it's just kind of, you know, it's like you've done so like you've done your job really well if no one comments on it.
I mean,
But then
I have so many, like being a film major, I have so many reservations and bad feelings about the way I feel like film has failed to live up to its potential in so many ways.
yeah. No, I know what you mean. And when I think about like, you know, but that like wasn't always the case with audio, you know, and if you look back at some like some of the older film scores where like I don't know, I always think of like Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann as like, you know, those are that's music like you super notice, like you know when the music is there.
Hmm.
Um, and it doesn't detract from the movie at all. It's like it makes the movie in a lot of times. But
Yeah.
like
Well, and
but
I
like
think
that's
of
not
like The Shining or Clockwork Orange or 2001: A
oh
Space
yeah,
Odyssey,
absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
like the music is or like Blue Velvet or something. The music is such a strong part of those all of those movies,
Yeah, yeah. And
and
so
to both of their benefit, like yeah.
yeah, and so it's weird to think about that as a model for game music. And it's something like I don't know about you, but I always feel very self-conscious about, and I'm always trying to like go kind of like I kind of go back and forth on, especially in game music when you don't necessarily know how long someone is going to take to like listen to this thing.
Hmm.
And so like especially if I'm like making a loop, like I don't want it to be like too obtrusive cuz at the front of people's attention because then that wears on your ear and you get tired of it. But then I don't want it to be like completely in the background and non-noticeable because kind of like what you're saying, like I want it to be I want it to be distinctive and I want it to actually add to the experience as opposed to just not detracting from the experience, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the huge problem that I've had with game stuff is like people don't really understand audio who are working on like games who want audio for the games, and oftentimes will be like, I want something, really strong and melodic, and it's like, well, it's going to repeat a lot. Like, are you sure you don't want something that is like, more soundscapey, that isn't going to
Right.
stick out as much that people will notice? So, well, no, I want this really good, melody, or, I want like, really strong, good music. And it's like, and the thing is like, if you want to sell your soundtrack or whatever, like people are going to buy stuff that's more melodic or whatever, and people are going to notice
Hmm.
you if you're
Hmm.
composing for games, if you're doing melodic stuff, if you're doing chiptune stuff, like so, and people will parlay that into doing performances or whatever. So like that's the kind of like if you try and do anything experimental, you're not going to sell and you're not going to make a name for yourself in that sphere. Where that many people care about you or whatever. And a lot of the people who are even making stuff don't want you to make that kind of stuff, even if it will
Right.
make the game better.
Right.
And that's kind of why I'm like, screw it. I don't know if I'm composing for games anymore.
Really.
Yeah, I mean, like outside of doing like little bits and pieces here and there, like I kind of have decided it's not really my thing. Um, it just 'cause like people don't really know what they want, and I am just frustrated of just being like something I feel like fits fine, and the person being like, no, that's not really what I want. And it's like, it,
Yeah.
I feel
It's
that
tough.
there's a Orson Welles clip where he's reading through like an advertisement, and he's like freaking out at the people who are like telling him to change his reading or whatever, and he just says the right reading is the one I'm giving you. And that's how I feel. I feel like Orson Welles is being like, damn it, the right reading is the one I'm giving you.
Yeah.
Take it or leave it.
Is it like a commercial for like peas or
Yeah,
something?
yeah, it's like about like cod or something like that. There's like, we know a remote
Right,
farm,
right.
or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and then
Yes,
and then there's
yes.
also a peas one. Yeah,
Or I think I remember,
it was made fun
or
of on like Pinky and the Brain.
yeah, I'm thinking of the Animaniacs one. Yeah. I'm thinking of the parody of it more than the actual thing.
The parody
But
of it like was, it's not
it's basic.
exactly word for word, but it's pretty close.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
But
no,
I love his response, because that's how I feel like a lot of the time. It's
right. No, it's a tough thing. I go back and forth on it a lot. I mean, like sometimes I think on the whole it's been like good for me to do game music, maybe just even like emotionally or psychologically. It feels like a weird thing to say, but like um it is kind of a different thing from some of the other stuff that I do because it is for like a specific thing or a function, and and it's for a specific person or a specific group of people in a different way than like other music. Like even if I wrote music for a certain person to perform, like they're not going to come back to me and be like, will you change this note here? So, like that's not, unless it's like unplayable, but like, that's not really the normal process between like a composer and a performer. But like in games, there is that thing of like, if it's not, it doesn't, yeah, if the music is good, like that's one thing, but like it's not so much whether the music is good as like does the music work for the game, where it is. And I've had that kind of like back and forth sometimes
and a lot of
where
the people who are working on games don't necessarily want something that works with the game.
yeah, yeah. I think I've just been honestly, I feel like I've just been like super lucky in that I've worked with people who do know what they want, and when I look back on it, I am like, oh yeah, actually they were right about that. That thing that I wrote was not right for it. Um, like 99 times out of 100. But like if someone doesn't know what they want or doesn't know how to articulate what they want, that's like, yeah, that's incredibly frustrating. And I've had that experience too. And the weird thing is that like sometimes it's even tough to tell which is which until after the fact. That's the really weird thing.
Yeah, and
Um,
people are often not good at conveying what they want. Um,
Yeah, it's hard. There's not like, even among musicians, there's not always like a common language.
yeah, I think like as some working with other people, like I kind of if I pick somebody, I want them to like if I pick somebody to work with, I know they're going to do a certain type of thing, and I'm okay with that. And I think oftentimes with games, it's like, no, oh, you're talented. Okay, here, do this certain type of thing. That's not necessarily exactly the type of thing that you do.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's the problem. If somebody like I know that somebody's not capable of going outside of their zone of what they make and like making exactly what I'm picturing in my head, then maybe I'll adjust what I'm picturing in my head to incorporate that. And that probably isn't a bad thing at all.
Right, right.
Um like there's an element of flexibility there, and I understand like people have their visions, you know, but like I just wonder I wonder if most people's visions are really that visionary or worth it, and wouldn't be made better by, some kind of conflicting elements, because
Right.
I even think of like someone like I mean, I'm really fascinated with both Stanley Kubrick and David Lynch, so I bring them up a lot, but like even like both of those people, like from what I know, like Stanley Kubrick has the reputation for being very exacting, but he
Right.
also, from everything that I've known, he is somebody who, if he saw, he's like waiting for the actors to do something interesting, and then
Right.
if he saw that, he'd be like, oh yeah, like what you're doing there is really great, and like trying to wait for those things to happen that are less predictable, or that capture something. And like so many artists that I really respect have that view of like, I'm waiting for the other person who's involved to do their thing and come up with something that I never would have anticipated and bring me into another direction, because it increases the amount of dimensions or possibility for uh, places that I can go. But if you're just in that, you have that like one idea, and you make everyone do that, like everyone's kind of, there's like a rigidity to it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think Kubrick's a really interesting person to think about in this context. Um, what you're talking about makes me think of like the music for 2001 and and how, I mean, do you know what happened with do you know the story about like the original score for 2001?
I don't.
Okay, so this is totally relevant. So Kubrick actually commissioned a composer to write the score for 2001, a composer named Alex North. And this score exists. He wrote the score. It's been recorded. Um, and and meanwhile, Kubrick had all these like, temp tracks in there, which were things like, the Blue Danube and this crazy music by this Hungarian composer Ligeti. He had all this music in there in this draft of the film, and then commissioned this composer to write this score. And then what ended up happening is Kubrick just didn't use any of it. He used none of it. And the composer actually didn't find out until he attended the premiere.
Oh, that sucks.
So Kubrick ended up going back to all that music that he found, that he collected, um, during the course of making the film, which is now like, all that music is so iconic and so associated with that film. Everything from that, Strauss opening to the really crazy choral music by Ligeti, like all of that music is so perfect for that movie. Um, but like, yeah, some composer had that experience of like that experience that you've had, an experience that I've had of like trying to write this music to fit, and it just doesn't it doesn't fit. It doesn't matter whether or not it's good music, but like, but I think that movie does benefit from like, I mean, you can't really go wrong with those pieces because all those pieces are like classic pieces.
Yeah.
I think in and of themselves. And so and I think they would be, even if they weren't associated with that movie. So it's kind of like it's almost unfair to ask like a composer to like, yeah, just come up with something as good as Strauss and Ligeti and the other Strauss and do it
Well,
like
and it's very
within a few months.
it's very particular pieces over their careers that they've made.
Right. And they're all super all over the map stylistically. Um,
So yeah, asking someone to I agree that like if you have an idea of something you just want to use that thing, then there's no reason to not do that. Like, I don't know.
yeah, but also apparently, I'm not totally sure, but I think the chronology or the exact story, but Georgi Ligeti, whose music is used in like the star, in the scene when they first find the monolith, and then the scene where they go through the Stargate.
Hmm.
Um, is it a Stargate? I forget what they call it. Starfield, whatever.
I don't remember. I remember the images from that movie, but I remember very little of the dialogue.
The really long scene where all the stuff that looks like an iTunes visualizer now.
Oh yes, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
um,
That's what I thought you were talking about.
yeah, yeah. Um, I I don't think they got his permission beforehand or something to use that music. So he was actually like super pissed. Um, at least for a while, but
Did
they apparently
didn't he use Ligeti's music for The Shining too?
well, yeah, I think at some point like they made up and they got along again, or something. But there was something where like he didn't ask permission or he asked maybe his agent's permission, but he didn't know about it personally or something. I forget what it was, um, but there was some conflict there as well. Um, but yeah, that's a film I could talk about the music like for a long time. There's an interesting thing that happens um, with the music in that almost kind of that I don't know was intentional or not, but after hearing it, I'm like I can't un. It's one of those things that you can't unhear. So like uh, I don't know how to describe this for this podcast. Do you know what I mean when when I talk about the harmonic series? Um,
I'm not sure I do.
so like there's this series of notes called the harmonic series, and that's basically the series of notes that resonate when either you know when either you bow a string or hit a string or blow something through a column of air. It's not just one note, right? It's
Oh,
actually like
okay, okay. I think I know
it's
what you mean.
actually like, when you bow a string, it resonates at a bunch of different frequencies, right?
Okay.
It resonates
And
at the
there
frequency
and
of the
there
whole
are
string and twice the
harmonics
string.
at like a fifth or whatever, and then like an octave, like with a cello or whatever. If you put your finger on the string without pressing it down at a certain point, it would make
Right.
like harmonics. I think it does that on guitar strings too. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and like on any string, there's these nodes where you get different notes.
So that's the harmonic series.
Yeah, so when you
Okay.
when you play the whole string, what you're actually hearing is all of those notes simultaneously, and our brain kind of like sums it into one note.
Okay.
And what gives different instruments their particular kind of sound, what gives different instruments their particular sound is like it's actually the combination of those frequencies that gives it its particular sound. Um, and so yeah, it's this kind of like musical intervals that are kind of mathematically related to one another.
Hmm.
And so the music in 2001 kind of actually progresses through the harmonic series because it starts off with that really simple ba ba ba, which is actually like the first minus the first octave, the first three notes of the harmonic series. And then the next kind of piece you hear is the Blue Danube, which is ba 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 ba, which is actually like the next part of the harmonic series. So it's like the next level up. So progressing from like the early, beginnings of humankind to the space age of humankind. And then when you get to the monolith, you hear all these really tiny intervals. Um, and you hear this like kind of complex tangle of tiny intervals, and that's the music of Ligeti. That's the choral music that you hear when you first encounter the monolith, and that's the music you hear when uh, when the astronaut is going through the Stargate and progressing to the next level of evolution. So it's progressing from these fundamental kind of early partials of the harmonic series to like smaller and smaller intervals, or like higher and higher up the harmonic series. Um, and it's something, once I read about that, I was like, I'm pretty sure Kubrick had no idea that he was doing this, that I don't know if he was doing that intentionally or not. I kind of suspect not, but it's so like um it's such like a to me it's such like a undeniable part of it. Like I can't unhear it.
Well, that's the power of intuition, I feel like.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, somebody who works as intuitively as he does, like, or he did, or like David Lynch or somebody does, like, there's that element where it's like, wow, there's this entire dimension, and no, I did not literally think about any of that consciously, but it comes up unconsciously when you like open yourself up to that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what you're, yeah, like a testament to the power of intuition, and maybe his intuition specifically, because that's some like weird magic stuff that he's channeling to do that sort of.
Well, I mean, if you think about how most people compose or how most people do art, maybe they have a certain idea or a certain form, but there's a
Yeah,
certain amount of comfort to it. Like, if you're making it within a certain form, you have an idea of what things that you like and what kind of heights or whatever that you'll reach or whatever. I'm not saying that this is always true, but like, um, oftentimes we and this is true of me, like I tried to break out of this a lot in recent years, but in the past anyway, like without recognizing it, I had certain forms or certain ways of approaching things just because they seemed to work, so I kept doing them.
right.
And I think like if you're trying to work on things intuitively, you don't necessarily you you often have to break with those forms to find something else, and
Right.
a lot of people are uncomfortable or afraid of doing that for good reason. I mean, like people oftentimes, like if you do something, if you make things that way, people won't really understand where the hell you're coming from, or they'll misinterpret
Right.
it. But I guess that's the power of intuition. You never really know where you're gonna go or where you're gonna end up. And I like that, and I think it's more. I get a lot more out of that now than making things another way. But like I think that's it's hard because
Yeah.
there's no set way of defining that.
The idea of making something intuitively rather than through some sort of analytical or more maybe rigorous approach or something like
Not
that.
even analytical. Well, I mean, some people do take that approach, and I mean, like going back to like new music, a lot of stuff. Actually, this is my problem with a lot of new music stuff is that it is trying to create rule sets and forms that don't really are kind of meaningless uh, and decontextualized. Like they're just forms for the sake of being forms. They don't
Yeah.
really have like a purpose outside of their forms that have been created. They might have historical context or whatever, but
Right.
I mean, and this is my problem. I understand music theory is like there's more basis for music theory, but like it's also my problem with music theory. Like in like I don't want to dismiss music theory entirely. Obviously, there's use for it, but
Yeah.
like and people aren't interested in trying to it's experimental, and experimental should allow more for this kind of approach that's more intuitive and more formless, but oftentimes people still just as strongly want to be looking or are desiring for forms and are very upset when those things aren't followed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think often what happens is that um, a piece of music or a body of music gets written through a largely intuitive process, and then someone, whether it's the person who wrote it or someone else, will like try and apply an analytical framework to it kind of after the fact. I think it kind of happens almost more after the fact.
Yeah, I
Um,
think you're right. But then once it becomes a thing, then people do start emulating that thing.
yeah, yeah, and that's sort of like immediately the point at which it sort of breaks down and it stops working. I don't know. I've taught theory a whole bunch, and it's sort of um, it's a frustrating thing to teach, and the way it's taught is kind of like as these rules. And I remember learning it and being like, wait, what? Like most music doesn't apply to these rules. Why am I learning these rules? And I didn't sort of see the utility of it until much later. Um, and so when I try and teach it, I try and present it as like, okay, what we're describing here is not like, um, some fundamental thing about how music works. This is more like this framework to understand how this specific group of people approach this one specific thing, um, and and it's tough because um, you end up kind of undermining. I feel like when I've taught it, I've erred almost too much on that side of things because then you end up kind of undermining what you're teaching from the very beginning. And it can be kind of overwhelming in that sense because as you're teaching like these basic rules, you're also saying, well, there's all these exceptions to these rules and blah, 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 blah. And it can get overwhelming to kind of subsume all that information or to separate out the information uh, that you need to know versus what's optional information. Um, it's really tough. It's this very intuitive thing that's kind of pretending to be this more empirical thing.
Hmm.
Um, and
Well, because it's art. It's not building a building. It's not the laws of physics.
right.
Or, but even the laws of physics are a lot more complicated than than we think that they are. But especially
Well,
with
right.
art, like,
Yeah, it's sort of like, you're teaching Newtonian physics and then at the same time you're saying, you know, this isn't really how the universe works. We know this isn't really how the universe works because we know that quantum mechanics also works and contradicts it, but it still works, it still functions, it still gets us good results. So let's learn it.
but
Uh,
I'd say it's even less like in the realm of art. There's even less of a solid standing for that because it's not about
right.
replicating things
Yeah,
per
that's a
se.
very loose analogy. And that probably pisses off a bunch of science people too. To use it.
Well, I mean, I feel the same way about video games, like the way that people talk about how to make video games or whatever often falls into that very scientific view, which is just
Right.
ridiculous because it's we're talking about art here, but it has that scientific view because of programming, and you have to do certain things in order for a program to be stable, and so there's an
Mhm.
architectural element, but beyond that, I don't know. Anyway, we don't have to get fully into that. I wanted to ask, like, first of all, like, if when you're going to conferences or things like that, new music, or when you're talking with other people who are involved in that sphere, what kind of do you have the sorts of conversations that like we're having right now, where you talk about inaccessibility or stuff, or like at these conferences, what are people talking about? What are the conversations that are happening?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, I would say I don't go to all the conferences, but the ones I go to are the ones that I've been to recently. There is kind of like a sense of urgency or anxiety. I mean, it feels like new music is like always in crisis of some kind. It's sort of like every few months there's like it feels like there's an article being published about like, is classical music dying or whatever. So I mean, there is a sense of, I think, urgency about these issues, and I think there's maybe a disagreement about how to solve them. And I think um, that's kind of maybe where you see people sort of striking out in different directions. Because I think there are some people who say we need to make the music specifically more accessible. And, whether that's like pop music influence or making the music more tonal or making it prettier or, whatever that means. I think that means different things to different people too. But there are people who say we need to change the music itself. And then there are other people, and like I'm kind of like, to me that, I think I already said this, but to me that feels a little bit like a red herring. And then there are other people who say, well, no, like we need to make the sort of apparatus around it more accessible. We need to make the way the concerts are presented to be more interesting and things like that. And then maybe another sphere around that would be also what people are talking about more slowly is kind of what we talked about before, the sort of economics and the diversity issues of it, and that being the real barrier.
Okay.
So these conversations are happening, I think, but I think there's also a sense of frustration and a sense of like certain things being outside of our sphere of control. Like one of the things that's I think a major challenge right now is kind of like a byproduct of what's happening to journalism in this country, where you see, a lot of like the print publications that people relied on to like report on, these kinds of musical events, are like laying off a lot of staff. And, one of the first things to be cut, would be like the art section. So you see it being written about less, or, for example, in Los Angeles, there's basically one person at the LA Times, Mark Swed, who writes about new music. And as far as like major publications goes, like that's it. And, there's people who have like blogs and stuff like that, but it's really frustrating to see so much activity. There's so much activity happening in this realm, and so little discourse about it.
So little is getting out to the outside world.
Yeah, and I know that you've talked about this too, and your sort of frustrations with music journalism specifically, and how it seems kind of like almost like a club.
It's impenetrable to me.
Yeah, yeah. So there's actually some, I mean, so for example, there's this venue in New York called National Sawdust. That's a fairly new thing, and they do lots of new music there. But they're actually coming out with the publication themselves, and they've actually hired this reporter who has covered on music and the arts for the New York Times and the Boston Globe. So they sort of like poached him from the Boston Globe to kind of like be one of the persons spearheading this publication. And it's something that I have really complicated feelings about, because it's like, okay, that's great. Like it's sort of like, okay, if no one else is going to do it, if no one else is going to write about it, like let's write about it ourselves, which I did for a little while. but then that starts to feel like really weird and insular and incestuous um, and kind of just like especially weird when you have like a venue sponsoring a publication. It's sort of like, well, are they going to write about stuff that's not likely to happen at their venue? You know, it's like a
Yeah.
little um,
It's like PR being,
right. It's PR and journalism becoming kind of
which is
inseparable.
which is the place that a lot of music and games journalism are at right now.
Right. Yeah, like with like YouTubers and stuff like that, it's kind of also hard to separate out. Um, yeah, like what's paid, what's sponsored,
Yeah.
and what's not. Yeah.
But so oh, sorry, did you have extra thoughts?
I should probably stop there with
Okay,
that.
cool. So what is like what is to be preserved about this world? Like what is worth preserving about it in contrast to other things? And
Oh,
in the future, like what are the good things about like new music, contemporary classical that you hope become a larger part of culture? You hope continue to be preserved?
that's a really good question. So I think it goes back to what you're talking about, what you mentioned. You sort of drew this distinction between being alienated by something because because you feel specifically excluded by it, or just or more being initially put off by something because you have to put in some effort to appreciate it. Is that fair? Is that kind of what
Yeah.
more or less what you said?
Yeah. That is.
Um, and to me, that's where the value is because uh, to kind of make an analogy with games a little bit. So there's this kind of general way of doing things in games, or there's these kind of genres that things fit into. Um, and if something doesn't fit into those genres, there's this kind of anxiety about, expectations that people bring to the game. So if a game doesn't have combat or doesn't have specific kinds of gameplay or whatever, it sometimes gets derided as like a walking simulator or something like that. Um, when it's more like, um, at least the ones that I like, it seems more like there's an openness to them, and that openness is um, allows you to kind of put more of yourself in the experience because the game isn't kind of railroading you in these specific ways, right? It's kind of
Mhm.
allowing you to have this more broad experience, but maybe because of that experience, there's not the same sort of like kind of like dopamine triggers that like get you to the next thing, right? Just in
Yeah.
like purely biochemical terms of like yes, let's mine for whatever.
Well,
Um,
and then there's uh but of course if you're somebody who spends a lot of effort or into trying to get something more out of something. It's like your palate, your flavor palate or whatever. Like
right.
if you eat Cheetos all the time or hamburgers or whatever, you're going to get used to that. But if you start eating a variety of different things and get used to flavors and stuff, then you begin to want that from what you're eating, and you begin to not be satisfied with something less. And I feel like that way about music for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and we bring the same kind of expectations to music, right? Like if we listen to a pop song, we're pretty sure we know what we're gonna get, though sometimes it's like delightful if it defies certain expectations that we have, right? Um, but then
Yeah.
if you step too far outside of that, um, then yeah, then there's not the same kind of like handholds. But then um, to me, that's kind of the part that's exciting to me. um, because that means that the music doesn't need to be, one of these like five things. It can be anything. Um, and, it can have so many different emotional affects, um, so many different things. And I think the struggle with encountering it, if you're not used to it, is maybe this anxiety of like, is this experience I'm having intentional or not? Like, is it intended by the creator of this work?
Hmm.
And so there's sometimes this feeling of and I've had this experience of you don't know whether to trust the creator of the work. Um,
Yeah,
and
that's hard.
and especially in a world where there's so many potential things that could command our attention, it's really easy to just disengage with something if it doesn't engage us within the first like 30 seconds or whatever.
Yeah, you really have to open yourself up to be able to do that, and
Yeah.
it definitely does put you in a more vulnerable state, I think.
Yeah. And that's why I think is so valuable about that um, concert hall, like live music experience to me. And part of it is because it could be a negative thing. Um, Part of it is because you're trapped in that situation, right? I mean, you could leave at any time if you wanted, but there's incentive for you to stay, right? Um,
Hmm.
you're kind of, there's social pressure. You don't want to be disruptive, um, and you're trapped in a way that you're not, than when you're at your computer or
You're
whatever.
you're a little forced to be uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think
Which is
that's
can be a good and bad thing.
yeah, to me it's such like a important part of the experience. There's been so many I can't count how many musical concerts I've been to where at the beginning I was just like so not into it. And then by the end I was like that was an incredible experience. Um, and part of it is just being in that other experience, being in that other world for an extended period of time,
Hmm.
I think has to do with it. And I think some of the theatrical things that people are trying to do with new music now is to kind of enhance that experience. Kind of
Hmm.
like the experience that you get talking about David Lynch, like going to a David Lynch film. You're kind of like immersed in this weird other world for X number of hours. Um, and if you were in that world for 5 minutes, it wouldn't have nearly the same impact.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you have to, because just because you see something that offends your senses in one way or another at one point doesn't mean that that thing is,
yeah, yeah,
you know, being indulged in a way that is like
yeah,
that it isn't being dealt with or thought about or whatever by the work itself.
right. But I think there is something, yeah, like I don't know, like a little bit frightening or like a little bit uncomfortable about that sometimes
I think
because
I think there is also social pressure to maybe give a little more respect when maybe it's not exactly warranted. Like, I mean,
yeah,
I won't say specifically, but there was somebody whose performance at that thing was obviously not at the level of the other ones, and everyone was kind of pretending that everything was great because they didn't want to, get
right,
on the bad side of, and and like sometimes people can do things that are objectionable, like they're either racist, transphobic, or sexist or whatever, and like it's
right,
hard that stuff. So there's like elements to that where people should be called out, maybe to some
yeah.
degree, and they're being given more respect or support than maybe they should be. But then on the other hand, it's complicated.
It's super complicated, and I know what you're saying, and I feel like especially uh, as as composers and new music uh, get older, they can sometimes become these kind of, I mean, certainly not all composers, but there's some composers who are kind of like almost like sacred cows where it's hard to like it's hard to challenge them on anything. I had I had an experience recently where um, there was a well, I'll just say who it was. There was a composer who's kind of like of the baby boomer generation, um, named Kevin Volans, who gave this speech where uh, he talked about all kinds of things, but he basically talked about how like uh, kind of like new music had down the tubes in his mind, and people weren't being as ambitious as they used to be, and things like that. And I wrote a sort of snarky Facebook post in response to it, just kind of like because it was cathartic to do so,
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of generational divide in the comments I received was really interesting because pretty much everyone, who I'd say like maybe be my friends or peers kind of were kind of on board with what I was saying and the language I was using as well because it was sort of like written in the language of a snarky Facebook post and not super like formal language, right?
Yeah.
And then I had one friend of mine who I actually like and respect a great deal, but he sort of sent me a message being like, I'm so dismayed that you did this, um, and I was really dismayed by his dismay. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I did all of a sudden feel this like social pressure not to call this person out, even though I think they deserve to be called out.
Yeah.
Um, so what I ended up doing was kind of maybe a compromise, and I don't even know if this was the best thing to do, but what I ended up doing was deleting the Facebook post and then writing a more like kind of formal thing about it that was then uh, published on a venue that was not Facebook. So like a more formalized response to it. Um, but the thing about that is that like, why should I have to? A little bit of me is still a little resentful about that. Like, why should I have to like, change my language to call out this person? And if this person wasn't like, a respected person in the field who was, 30 years older than me, I wouldn't, no one would blink twice at me making that snarky blog post.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I always err on the side of, well, for most of the time. Sometimes I have Twitter tantrums and then delete
That's
because I feel bad,
time tradition.
but yeah, but like I feel like it's often better for those thoughts to be out there if they already exist than not. I mean, not all the time, but I don't know. I especially like if it's like an establishment that needs to hear it even if they don't like it, you
Right.
know. But I don't know. I guess before we go, I wanted to ask you also about your concert series. We didn't talk about that at all.
Oh yeah. Um, I don't know. I have a concert series. It's called People Inside Electronics. And we do concerts kind of in and around Los Angeles. So the thing that I'm really interested in about this concert series is that it does combine, uh, live acoustic instruments, live chamber music with electronics. And we try very hard, I have to say, to not fit into that genre of what you're talking about, of kind of like having someone noodling and then having weird sounds come out. Um, so it's kind of like um, trying to make that interaction more meaningful, um,
Mm-hmm.
and making that interaction more musically meaningful and more audible, so you actually hear the relationship um, between what's happening with the electronics and with the live instruments, and then
Mm-hmm.
also doing things uh, where we have a more uh, things that you can only do live. Like one of the concerts we had our last season was we worked with an ensemble called Southland Ensemble to perform this piece called Rainforest, which is by this composer David Tudor. And the idea behind Rainforest is that a bunch of the idea with Rainforest is that any potential object can be a sound source, can resonate, and so
Oh, I think I've seen this. I think I've seen this installation, or maybe something similar to it at
yeah,
Mills.
so there's people have done different versions of this installation. So we had a version of this installation where people built all, you end up having to build all these homemade electronics, and so the
Yes.
people from Southland Ensemble build these devices that then resonate various objects around the room. And so it becomes this kind of soundscape that you walk into. And then we commissioned a really great composer named Carolyn Chen to to write a piece that was sort of situated within this installation, a piece called Other Forests. So this piece would kind of emerge from the soundscape of the installation. Um, so things like that that you can't really do in any other sort of setting is really um, what what I get excited about doing with that concert series.
Yeah, that's cool. Is this through Cal Poly Pomona?
It's not. So it's sort of it's extracurricular. It's a series that I've directed or co-directed since I think 2009.
Oh, okay.
So we're going into our seventh season, and we haven't announced our next season yet, but
Okay.
it will be soon.
And it's in LA, correct?
It's in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming on my show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks for inviting me. I feel like this was a really fun conversation. I was kind of all over the place, but hopefully I said enough interesting things.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the nature of the show. Well, thank you. I've been talking to Isaac Schankler, who's a game composer, also professor of new music at Cal Poly Pomona in LA. Yeah, and I'm Liz Ryerson. This is Beyond the Filter. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Liz.